It's no secret that Diablo 4 intends to be a successor to the previous Diablo games and be a massive, hopefully, success for Blizzard and potentially one of the biggest and hopefully again best releases of the entire decade. However, there is one thing that I think everyone can agree on that is arguably the most controversial thing in Diablo 4, and that is the open world. Now, there's a few things that go along with this open world, but I want to talk about it, give my opinion, and respond to some of your comments because we have a lot of people that dislike it, but we also have a lot of people that potentially like it. Let's get into it. So before we dive into any sort of comments, I want to give you my opinion on the open world and what I think it'll do, as well as whether or not I'm going to enjoy it. Now, there's a few considerations with the open world that we have to talk about before we even talk about opinions, and that is it's forced, so you cannot avoid it, similar to an MMO. The second thing is that it's dynamic leveling, which means that the monsters scale to whatever level that you are, not the area. Therefore, a lower level player can be stronger than you comparatively. And the third thing is that the areas scale based on how many players are in the area. Therefore, if you have a lot of players, it gets more difficult, which could potentially be a big negative. Okay, so my open world opinion is this. I think it's a good overall good thing for the game. Reason being, I'm more of an MMO player. I enjoy seeing other players around me and participating in content just as I do. More importantly than that, I think a lot of the events associated around the open world are extremely engaging and make it feel like an alive world, specifically when you're talking about world bosses or when you're talking about potentially in the future, like the Tree of Whispers, those events where you see people completing tasks in the world. It makes something like Diablo, which is a super, super dark world, and in Diablo 4 it is, feel like there are other people struggling around you, right? And I just enjoy that feeling. But again, this is someone who is typically biased towards MMO gameplay, and this is an MMO feature. Are there negatives? There absolutely are. And a few criticisms that I have of the open world is that you really can't avoid any sort of trolling to some degree, which is people coming in and essentially leeching events. This happens in MMOs as well, although it's typically not that big of a deal in MMOs because the scaling is a little bit different. On top of that, it kind of, in some cases, takes away from the dark, depressing, kind of secluded world by only having or potentially having 4, 5, 6 people in an area instead of just you fighting off all these demons. There's also the other thing, which is dynamic leveling, and I think this deserves its own sort of tangent because this is a huge conversation about some of the pros and cons here. Now, I personally like dynamic leveling for the game, and there's a few reasons why, but I want to start off with the negatives first. The first negative is due to the dynamic leveling system, the early leveling process up until you get to those later stages when you can actually start formulating a good build, you're going to end up feeling a little bit weaker every level, except for when you get that huge legendary drop, you're going to instantly get super strong, and then as you start to level, you'll get weaker and weaker until you get that huge drop again. This is very different from every other game, and it kind of goes against this sense of I'm getting stronger, I'm getting more experienced as a character, and that kind of ruins the roleplay fantasy for a lot of people. On top of that, as I already mentioned, you can interact with people that have basically nothing on them, no levels, and are doing more damage than you are due to the dynamic leveling process. And I think those are the two main criticisms of this, and I think those are totally fair criticisms of the dynamic leveling system. But to me, the positives outweigh the negatives, and that is that this game, if they're trying to appeal to the most wide audience, you're going to have to appeal to the casual players, and the dynamic leveling system is a perfect example of how Diablo 4 is catering towards them, right? The dynamic leveling system allows you to basically play with all your friends at any point, regardless of level, and allow you to contribute essentially equally, if not the lower level players contributing more to the progress of whatever you're doing. This is critical for games that want to encourage group play and get a lot of casual players involved. One of the biggest downsides to a lot of MMOs is that, hey, you might have a really high level character and your friend may want to try out the game, but then you go to them and you either have to make a new character and follow them through the whole game, or you're going to have to go ahead and basically tell them, hey, yeah, play 100 hours and then come back to me. And this is usually not a really fun experience for that newer player. And even if they're getting carried, let's say, it's also not a fun experience because they're getting carried. They're not even playing the game. And so that's a huge positive, and I think that generally outweighs the negatives. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone's okay with this. Mostly the more hardcore, the more dedicated players are generally going to be a little bit more frustrated with the dynamic leveling system for reasons that are pretty simple. They want to play solo, they want to go ahead and dive in and not rely on anyone and not be affected by anyone. Again, that's just a huge portion of it, and both the open world and dynamic leveling system kind of counteract that. So that's where I want to talk about some of your critiques and some of your comments on this, because I think it's an interesting discussion to have. So let's talk about some of your comments, suggestions, and potentially options for the future. First one here is by Tyler. Honestly, not interested in seeing other player characters while I'm playing Diablo, but I guess that's how it's going to be. Tried turning it off, but he still saw players. In this game, you can turn off cross-play. I think it's very important that people understand that. There's an option to turn off the ability to see other players from other consoles, but you cannot turn off players in its entirety. There's a big difference. It says local, like basically console. If you're on PC, you can't see Xbox, PS players, etc. And I think that a lot of people really do have this perspective where it's like, it's a Diablo game. Why are we getting these changes? And I do think that it's totally fair to have a personal preference. But what I don't necessarily agree with, which is that this is a game and how it's supposed to be. Therefore, if it changes, it's not good. That I don't necessarily agree with. I do think it's totally fine. Like if you played Diablo because you liked the fact that it was sort of more of a solo player experience, that's saying something. And I believe this is where Tyler's coming from. And I think that's totally fair. And I do think that, again, there are a lot of people that feel this way. And that is, again, why this video is being made. It is a super hot topic. And unfortunately, you can't turn it off. Would I guess you could say, for someone who just enjoyed the open world, would I enjoy having the option to turn it off? It's kind of hard to say, because I would say that, yeah, that's fine, as long as they keep potentially the world bosses and such sort of scaled to a minimum amount of players, like 4 to 6 or so. And you might say, well, that's being exclusive. Well, I think that's just how the game is designed in the open world, right? If you're soloing bosses, then you're going to get better loot, whereas people who are grouped together are not necessarily. So now you have some sort of meta. And you could say the opposite is true, right? Where, well, if you're grouped, you're going to get better loot than being a solo player. But the point is that the open world is the innovative part of Diablo 4, and I don't think that they're going to steer away from that. Like, that is the reason why it was made, or Diablo 4 is the way it is, because Blizzard wanted to have this open world. And so if that's the focus, then I do think it should be balanced around that. Here's another comment by Swank. Diablo is not an MMO, and Blizzard putting a ton of MMO features could end up just being awful. If I wanted to play WoW, I would. And this is, again, similar to the previous comment, which is that Diablo is a way that it was, and I enjoyed Diablo. I don't want to play another game. And that's kind of, to some degree, how it feels. I can completely relate to that, right? For me, I think the biggest comparison that I'll make is Guild Wars 2. It's a game that I play a lot, and that has a really heavy focus on the sort of dynamic leveling, on the open world and open world events. But the thing is, I actually really enjoyed Guild Wars. I also really enjoy Diablo, and actually mixing sort of elements from Guild Wars into Diablo has made the game better for me. But I can totally understand if people are feeling the opposite, in that, you know, hey, Diablo is supposed to be grinding gear, etc., etc. I want to grind gear, play solo, feel that dark and damp kind of experience, and I'm just not getting that with the MMO features. I do think it could potentially also cause some problems with the seasons, because MMOs, as I've mentioned in other videos, are designed around a long-term player base. When you have a seasonal reset, where every 3 months you're resetting, the MMO features start to become a real big drag. So I can definitely see that becoming a pretty big problem as well. Here's another comment by Puchimama, whoops. And that is, dynamic leveling ruined the game for me, sadly. This is a big comment, by the way. I'm not going to read all of it, but I will basically get to the point here, which is, I do agree that it's great you can play with your friends, but to me, the disadvantage, it completely eliminates any sense of progression prior to level cap. Is far more of a disadvantage than the increased accessibility is an advantage. The entire reason I play an RPG is for that feeling of progression. And they go on to explain that they were feeling weaker, and there are positives like the potential playing with your friends, and they suggest a few options, making it potentially opt-in, so you can choose whether or not you can enter it or not. Make it so the higher level character is almost a little bit stronger than a lower level character. I do think that is an important factor, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then make it so that higher level players can scale themselves down to lower level players, but not vice versa. For the third point, this is actually already how the game works. If you're a level 3 character, if you go to a level 25 zone, the monsters will be level 25, and you'll be level 3 and you'll die. This has already happened, so that necessarily is already in the game. But for part 2, or for point 2, which is make it so that the higher level character is almost a little bit stronger, this is exactly what I was referring to earlier, which is that scale the higher level players down, but then keep the lower level players to what they are now, but make the higher level players scale down to max stat lower level players, if this makes sense. Now, this is how Guild Wars 2 does it. If you're a level 80 character, you go back to a level 1 zone, you're going to one-shot everything. Why? Because the game scales you down, but it basically gives you max stats, assuming you've passed sort of that like stat cap, right? So if you're running like, let's say, a damage dealing build, you're going to have like max damage for that level. And I think this is a very, very interesting way that Diablo 4 could potentially do. I guess the only difference is that since Diablo 4 is heavily based around legendary aspects and your specific combos, that this makes it a little bit awkward. And on top of that, you actually have a lot more abilities available to you. So maybe we'll see that this is coming true, but I do think that they need to make it some way so that your higher level characters actually do more. And then, of course, making it opt-in. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this is kind of an awkward thing because to me, no matter where you go, you're going to upset someone. If you make it opt-in, the people who want open world are going to be pretty upset. Why? Well, because if you don't balance that around being open world content, then you kind of ruin the whole reason why open world exists, which is that the open world is meant to be sort of a collaborative process where you're defeating high level content around where people are just finding finding you or what not, you're just finding random players in the open world. And I think making it so that, let's say, you can fight bosses alone and just beat them and get the loot, it ruins the sort of excitement and fun aspect of the open world. However, you make it more dedicated to the open world, people who want to play solo are upset. So either way you go, you kind of have a situation where people get upset. And I personally don't like the aspect where you can just solo everything at scale down to your level. But I don't think it's a big problem if you, again, scale it down to, let's say, a party of 4 and you have to solo it, but it has the stats as if you were playing with 4 players. I think that's more of a reasonable situation. Again, keeping in mind that this is Blizzard's idea. Blizzard wants an open world. If Blizzard wanted a solo player game, I wouldn't be sitting here telling you, yeah, well, they should make an open world. I don't like this part. It's sort of more of a compromise with the idea that there are other perspectives out there. Now, I know I took a lot of comments that were more of the negative perspective, and that's because they are, I guess you could say, disagreeing with me. So I wanted to, I guess, represent that. But I also have a couple comments here that actually really did appreciate the aspect. This was on the previous endgame video. I liked they were doing, or Peter says, I like what they were doing. The Tree of Whispers are more like emissaries in WoW. Do a couple things each day and get some rewards. It seems like there's different things to do at endgame and that they will add more. D2R is grind some gear, kill Ubers. After that, grinding geared runes you don't really need until you get bored. And I do agree. I think that the content itself, the open world content, is actually much more exciting, even though it's not necessarily not repetitive. I completely don't agree with people saying that it's not repetitive. I absolutely think it's repetitive, but that's totally fine as long as, it's rewarding, and to some degree it mixes things up slightly, right? That's okay with me. But at the same time, I actually really enjoy open world content. I enjoy seeing people and getting rewards. So that to me is more favorable than grinding greater rifts or playing D2. Next thing and last one, and this one's more of a fun one just to end it off here. Anyone remember the feeling of RuneScape Wilderness PvP, killing players for their loot? That is the feeling I'm getting from some of the PvP in Diablo 4. And this is another thing with the open world, which I didn't even touch on. It maybe needs a whole video, but I do think that it's a pretty, a pretty big one for the select few that enjoy PvP, and that is that open world's going to have open world PvP if you would like to engage in that, which I think is a really, really cool thing and a fun, enjoyable thing, which you will not get if open world did not exist. Now, again, if you go back to potentially opt out, well, you can opt out of PvP, and that's a whole other conversation that I just had. But I do think that there are a lot of innate advantages to the open world, and this is one of them for those people that really enjoy PvP. And I think it's a pretty fun one, and absolutely, it reminds me of RuneScape. I've played I don't know, I played since I was 6 years old. I played a ton of RuneScape, so it's a lot of fun. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. I think this is an interesting discussion to have, and I appreciate all of you dropping comments. I think it's more interesting to talk about the game and some of the pros and cons of each thing. But I enjoyed the open world. Let me know if you disagree, and I'll see you all for the next one.